This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you very much, Daniel Miller, and thank you very much for all of you being here. I'm delighted and I was honoured to be invited to give the biennial Martin Miller and Norbert-Miller Memorial Lecture. It's a special honour, I suppose, somewhat daunting to step into the shoes of that exuberant polymath Heinz Wolff, father of bioengineering, who gave the first lecture in this series a couple of years ago, in which he recounted something of his own life and experiences in a talk that he entitled The Making of a Refugee Scientist, a very distinguished scientist he, of course, has been. My own background and achievements are rather less interesting or noteworthy, despite the kind of comments that Bill has just made. I suppose as an academic and a broadcaster, I've been more of an observer than a doer. And despite my strange surname, I'm not a German or an Austrian Snowman, but I'm a descendant of a mixture of Cohens and Lazaruses and Wartskis and Snow people who came from various parts of the old Pale of Settlement. I suppose the one thing that I have done that might qualify me to give this lecture is the book that Bill kindly mentioned, The Hitler Emigrés, and as he said, it first appeared over a decade ago. The paperback appeared exactly 10 years ago. And since then, of course, history has moved on. Many of the distinguished people that I wrote about in the book, and many of those that I interviewed when doing my research, are sadly no longer with us. Some are, and a few are, I'm very happy to say, I think, in this audience today. But the subject itself is also moving on, almost moving now from what you might call memory into history. So today's lecture, as I say, is a kind of Hitler Emigrés revisited. I hope there are chairs at the back. How lovely to see you all. Thanks for coming. As the Nazi era and its immediate aftermath gradually fade from memory, how should we now look upon the achievements, particularly the cultural impact, of the generation that fled Central Europe and found a home in this country? Jane, let's have the lights off just for a moment for the beginning, because I want to show you one or two pictures. You'll note that I'm using the word emigres. Bill just mentioned what is an exile, what is an emigre. By no means all the emigres, of course, were necessarily refugees, for example. Another word that's frequently used. My subtitle of my book is Refugees from Nazi, but even that's not that accurate. Hayek was not a refugee. Gombrich was not a refugee. Korda, the film producer, came to this country to work and stayed on as things gradually got worse in Central Europe and this was a better place to be. Gombrich came here to work. Max Perutz, great, wonderful man, a Nobel Prize winner, a very sweet, gentle man, great figure in the sciences, came here I think originally as probably as a PhD student, and then gradually things got worse and worse at home, and it was better to stay on. Eric Hobsbawm, only recently the late, came here as a teenager, an adolescent really, from Hitler's Germany, not as a refugee, but with a British passport under the care of an uncle who had work here. So there were many different kinds of categories. Some, of course, were refugees, but not in this country during the war. George Schulte came to this country rather as Karl Popper, the philosopher, did after the war, having spent the war years elsewhere. Popper was in New Zealand, Schulte was in various places, including Switzerland. And of course, there were a tiny handful of people who came to this country after the war, having miraculously survived the worst horrors of Nazism. People like the musicians Rudolf Schwarz, Anita Lasker, Rabbi Hugo Gryn, for example. While we're on the subject of terminology, you'll notice I haven't been using the word exile, even though I probably should, particularly in view of the Research Centre for German and Austrian Exile Studies, who are in the way our hosts tonight. The word exile, difficult one. I remember a typical reaction from one of the people I interviewed when I wrote my book all those years ago. I was interviewing people in the late 90s and the early 2000s, and I remember one man said to me, "An exile," and I'm quoting, "is someone who hangs his harp up on the willow tree and yearns for his homeland," his Heimat. I spent the first, actually he had still a bit of a vestigial German accent, which I don't want to imitate. He said, "I spent the first 15 years of my life in Germany, and I spent the next 65 in Britain. This is my homeland." Some of you will remember dear Carl Flesch, the son of the violinist. Very sweet man. He told me he found it very irritating when after many decades here, he'd go to the post office or to a shop or something, and there'd be some bright young kid behind the counter trying to be helpful and friendly and say, "Oh, where'd you come from?" And he said, "Where do I come from? I come from Swiss Cottage." Or St. John's Wood or whatever it was, you know. And indeed my predecessor giving this lecture, Heinz Wolf, described himself as an English gentleman with a German accent. And why not? Exiles, a few of the Hitler emigres, for want of a better title, they did go back and live in their old homeland, some of them. Some of them were communists, very excited by East Germany, East Berlin in particular, following, you know, in a way as Brecht did. Others, like the physicist Max Born, for example, went back to Germany, felt it was their duty to help rebuild post-war Germany. Some wouldn't set foot in Germany. Those are surely not exiles in that sense. And many thought they could do it just as well from this country. People like George Weidenfeld, telling Chancellor Merkel what to do there. Weidenfeld, or the Amadeus Quartet, who had a long contract with Deutsche Grammophon and visited, of course. Weidenfeld would publish English translations of books by bright young German and Austrian authors. So today, for want of a better term, we're talking about the Hitler emigres, and in particular their impact on British cultural life. By cultural life, I should say, I really mean what the emigres themselves meant by it, what the word meant 60 years ago. High culture, the intellectual life, the high arts, old-fashioned view of the word culture. It's now, of course, taken on a kind of social, anthropological meaning, values and so on. So my focus is on what the emigres brought to art, architecture, film, photography, music, literature, the press, the humanities, the sciences, and so on. What resulted when people schooled in the high culture of pre-Hitlerian Mitteleuropa, Bildung, high culture, began to mix their labours with the rather different, rather gentlemanly world they found when they came to Britain. Bloomsbury, Garden Cities, John Reed's BBC, and so on. What happened when architects schooled in the Bauhaus style, glass, steel, concrete, modernism, encountered the oldie world revivalism of an architect in this country, like Lutschewitz. Painters used to expressionist work, or the work of someone like Egon Schiele, come across the work of Augustus John and his sister Gwen. What happened when musicians, some of you may have been watching the television series or going to the South Bank, this current festival this year about 20th century music. Think of the impact on musicians trained in the harsh modernism of Schoenberg, encountering the gentle pastoralism of Vaughan Williams. I really searched long and hard to find a pretty picture of VW with a cup of tea. What about filmmakers? There are a lot of film people, actors like Martin and Helen Miller, but many others, and directors. If you were brought up in Berlin in the film world after the First World War, you were probably brought up in the world of Dr. Caligari or Metropolis. And you come to nice, genteel England with the world of Noel Coward or Jesse Matthews. They're in Head Over Heels in Love. And I wonder what it can have been like, being an actor like Martin Miller, raised in the fearless culture of cabaret, or Hannah, who'd been trained in the Reinhardt seminar. You know, talking of fearless, Martin Miller's most famous early success on these shores, as I'm sure some of you will know, was a brilliant and rather scary takeoff of Hitler. He happened to be doing this thing, broadcasting this thing on April the 1st, but at first people didn't know, and he could do an amazing Hitler act, which was pretty scary. Later, as Bill mentioned, he went on and had a very distinguished career in film and television, often portraying wonderfully eccentric characters with a skill that few other actors could rival. And I'm very honoured to be speaking in his memory and that of his wife. Jane, let's have the lights on, shall we? Because I want to be able to see what I'm doing and talk to you rather than show you pretty pictures. I don't want to exaggerate the difference between these two worlds, these two cultures. And there was, of course, some overlap. There were cultural Teutonophiles in Britain, people like John Christie, found with Blindborn, who loved nothing more than donning his lederhosen and going off on a tour down the Rhine. And of course there were Anglophiles in Central Europe, who had the temerity to think Shakespeare superior to Goethe. Not that many, though. By and large, we're talking about two cultures that were very different, and indeed largely mutually ignorant. And it was the advent of Nazism and the desperate migration that followed that, as a byproduct, brought these two cultures face to face. And it was the interaction between the two that helped create the richly mixed cultural milieu from which I, and I suspect all of you, have so greatly benefited. Looking back now, 2013, I can see that the whole topic touches on, that I was trying to research all those years ago, it touches on a lot of other subjects as well. In some respects, what I was trying to write about, I suppose, was an illustration of what we might call cultural transfer. I was trying to write, what I was trying to write about was an illustration of cultural transfer. What happens when people raised in one environment go to live among people imbued with another? How far do they assimilate, integrate, acculturate, or perhaps choose to stay in a cultural ghetto? And there's been a lot of literature in much more recent times about the pros and cons of multiculturalism, for example. I was also, although I don't think I realized it at the time, writing a generational study. There's a lot of evidence, a lot of academic evidence now, that older migrants find it, of course, harder to adjust to a new country and an unfamiliar language than their children. Compare the experience of the once celebrated Berlin theatre critic Alfred Kerr, whom Richard Dove, who's sadly not able to be with us today, but whom he, for example, among others, has written about very movingly, with Alfred Kerr's children, Michael and Judith, one of whom became a very distinguished judge, and the other, of course, a leading writer, particularly for children and adolescents. Did German and Austrian emigres leave a different mark on their new homeland? It's been argued that the German emigres tended on balance to be more radical and gravitated more towards the United States. Think of people like Brecht or the Frankfurt philosophers and others. Whereas those raised in old Austro-Hungary found conservative, class-bound Britain more of a magnet. I think that's probably too schematic. It's an interesting idea, but looking back, I think what there was a difference between the impact of the migration from Nazism on British and American cultural life, and that overall it was arguably greater in this country. It's not only that the numbers who came to the UK were proportionately, of course, larger. In addition, Britain in the 1930s was a comparatively homogeneous society, so that a sudden wave of migrants made much more cumulative impact here than in the United States, which after all had been historically built up by wave upon wave of migrants. Also in America, the Hitler emigres, they may have landed, many of them, in New York, but they tended to get dispersed to Yale, to Chicago, to Harvard, to Black Mountain College, to Hollywood, wherever. Whereas in Britain, by and large, they were more concentrated in London, rather than all around the country. Which is why in my work I've concentrated largely on London, with an occasional foray to elite places like Oxford or Cambridge or Edinburgh or Glyndebourne. And I've also concentrated primarily on men. I know it's all very politically incorrect, I don't know whether there are any members of the thought police here this evening, but I would humbly submit, so Hans Keller always used to say at the BBC, I would humbly submit, and then he said something very unhumble and absolutely threw the opposition. I would humbly submit, as Hans used to say, that in pre-Nazi Central Europe, active involvement in high culture was predominantly a masculine pursuit. Or think of the architects, the orchestral conductors, and so on. Of course, I talk about a number of women in my book, in my research, Lucy Ree, Hilda Beer, Milan Kosman, Hans's widow, and so on. But we're talking about a more masculine, male-dominated activity than perhaps would be the case if we were talking about high culture these days. Anyway, each of these topics, I think, warrants probably a huge lecture in itself. But I want, for the rest of my talk this evening, to concentrate on three further perspectives that seem to me to have acquired particular resonance in fairly recent times, in the years since I worked on that book. First, I sense that studies such as the book I wrote and other similar books have more and more come to be regarded as part of the wider field of Nazi and Holocaust studies. I often find it included as though it were about Nazis and the Holocaust, etc., which peripherally, of course, to some extent it is. Secondly, some people have turned to this kind of literature as evidence of a specifically Jewish contribution to culture. And again, there's a large issue there, which I'll say a few words about later on. And thirdly, as migration issues loom ever larger, you know, every other day Theresa May is something about immigration. Just read the Daily Mail every day, or rather don't, but you know. So all these three topics seem to me to be things that put into a different perspective what I wrote about years ago as a kind of current living thing within historical memory. And I'd like to try and say a little bit about all three of those, because all three of them have risen up the ladder of current relevance. So first then, Nazism, the war, the Holocaust, Hitler, etc. The past decade or two have seen an enormous growth of interest, or regrowth of interest in that period. Endless succession of films, books, TV programs on the subject, some of them very good. I'm currently reading a forthcoming book by Michael Haas, who's here today, about the composers whose music was banned by the Nazis, a book coming out in a couple of months' time. And in the run-up to the 75th anniversary of the Anschluss, which of course is imminent, an enterprising publisher, Persephone, is bringing out the novel The Exile's Return by Elizabeth de Waal, the grandmother of Edmund de Waal of Hair with Amber Eyes fame. And these, and I think this and other similar books are going to be discussed at the Jewish Book Week, which is imminent. Hardly a week goes by now without prominent press coverage of a Nazi-related story of some kind. The death of an elderly Holocaust survivor, perhaps. Something about looted art treasures. Just the other day, really while I was refining this lecture in the last 2 or 3 weeks, I was reading about how Golden Dawn, the right-wing Greek political party, is forging dangerous links with neo-Nazis in Germany. A week or so before that, it was the MP David Ward supposedly equating the way the Jews treat the Arabs with the methods adopted by the Nazis. Anne Frank's diary and associated material suddenly becoming available in digital form. That was a news story not long ago. Do you remember? There's a novel satirizing Hitler that's topping the bestseller lists in Germany. Should it be allowed? Is it funny? And all that. And a very interesting new book exonerating Pope Pius XII somewhat from the familiar charge that he did nothing to alleviate the sufferings of the Jews during the war and thereby contributed to them. A book that's just been brought out just precisely when the Pope is in the news for other reasons. There are obviously very good reasons why the Nazi era retains such a powerful purchase upon the collective imagination. The unprecedented barbarity, unreigned by the Third Reich, continues to hold the attention, while the epic struggle by which it was overcome provides inexhaustible material for inspiration and research, of course. But I think there are further reasons why this era has almost returned to particular prominence here in relatively recent times. The very method by which the war ended, the dropping of the atomic bombs, gave notice of a new threat to civilization. And for 45 years, we all lived under the threat of nuclear holocaust. The end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union caused people to rub their eyes with disbelief, and we all gradually realized that thermonuclear war had been avoided, at least for the time being. One incidental result of this was the opening up of Soviet and East European archives and their accessibility to Western scholars. Scholars like Ian Kershaw and others have pointed out that that helped shift the center of gravity for historical research from Germany itself to Russia and its former satellite territories, such as Poland, the very epicenter, of course, of the Holocaust. One very practical reason, perhaps, for the growth of interest in the Holocaust in the last couple of decades or so. More generally, the end of the Cold War seems to me to have removed many of the geopolitical certainties of the previous half-century, a bipolar world of good guys and bad guys. And I think there's been something of a hankering for the black and white moral certainties of an earlier era. I sometimes think people, not me, not you, but other people, need a kind of hate figure to function properly, you know, as part of a healthy psychological toolkit. Think how over the years we've lapped up almost incredible stories about a succession of evil characters, Idi Amin, Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, Osama bin Laden, and so on. Each of them demonized and routinely, of course, compared with Hitler. More recently, perhaps for some, it's been Iran's President Ahmadinejad or Syria's Assad, for example. Now, it's often been pointed out that back when we were fighting World War II, the British seemed remarkably good-humoured, well-adjusted to reality, and lacking in neurosis. This was, after all, a war in which pretty much everybody in Britain believed in the cause for which they were fighting, which is not always true of every war since. So perhaps it's not surprising if, robbed of the psychologically convenient ogre of the Soviet Union, popular attention in Britain has reverted yet again to the evils of Nazism. I think it's an element of that. I wouldn't want to exaggerate it. But I think there's a third reason, too, for the recurrent huge interest in the Nazi era, and it's to do with Britain's subsequent history. You know, the Second World War was the last time the UK played an absolutely pivotal part in world affairs. Time passed, the empire pretty much disappeared, and as British prominence on the international scene receded, many people found themselves once more seeking solace and perhaps inspiration from the truths and the myths of wartime. Politicians are not immune from the temptation, I might say, and successive leaders have evoked the spirit of Churchill. David Cameron was quoting Churchill in India only yesterday. You know, it's almost routine to evoke the Churchillian spirit when wanting to send troops to defeat the evil machinations of ruthless foreign dictators, whether in the Falklands or Iraq or Libya or wherever. And I think there's one further all-important reason why the Nazi era has returned to even greater prominence than before, and particularly Holocaust studies. By the turn of our new millennium, I still think of this century as being fairly new, but you know what I mean. By this time, many people with personal experience of the war were passing away. And for their grandchildren's generation, it was in danger of becoming consigned, almost like the Battle of Agincourt or the Armada, to kind of myth, you know, like Napoleon or Julius Caesar or whatever it was. Something that once happened. But the events of World War II have been so momentous that many surviving members of the older generation, and I'm very moved to see some of them here this evening, became ever more determined that first-hand knowledge of this, of all wars, should be preserved. Personal memories came to be recorded and videoed, archive banks accumulated, educational courses installed, museums opened. I think of projects such as Steven Spielberg's Shoah Foundation, or in this country, of course, Refugee Voices, wonderful collection of filmed interviews with refugees from Nazism, co-directed by Tony Grenville and Bear Lefkowitz, both of whom I'm very delighted to see here. And not to mention the Holocaust exhibition at the Imperial War Museum, for example. Incidentally, all the interviews that I recorded for my book back a dozen, 15, 18 years ago are now permanently lodged in the Imperial War Museum archives. When I recorded them, many of the interviewees told me they'd never before spoken in such detail about their early years, but were glad at last to have done so before it was too late. I sense an almost palpable desire to spin out for as long as possible the memory of Nazism, migration, the war, and its aftermath, as if one could retain the chain until the last link is finally broken. So for all these reasons, I suppose it's inevitable that some should see, a book with the title The Hitler Emigrés as part of a growing literature about Nazism, the Holocaust, and that era. It's also been seen as illustrating what we might call the Jewish contribution to culture. Very contentious and difficult issue, but let me try and address it as best I can. First thing to say, of course, is that many of the Hitler emigres that I wrote about were not Jewish. So far as I know, the founding fathers of Glyndebourne, Karl Ebert, the director, Fritz Busch, the conductor, were not Jewish. I don't think Kokoschka was, or Schwitters. There's an interesting Schwitters exhibition on at the Tate at the moment, by the way. Or Fritz Schumacher. I don't think he was Jewish, the small is beautiful man, nor were Gropius. Or Rudolf Laban. The ballet lovers will know, of course, about Laban. Both Gropius and Laban tried to make a kind of accommodation to the Nazi regime and found that it was impossible and finally left. But they were emigres from Nazism. Many of the Hitler emigres, of course, huge numbers were Jewish, but only nominally so. Wasn't the big issue with them. To my father, this is Klaus Moser speaking, Lord Moser, in the interview he did with me. To my father, being German came first. He thought of himself as a German and only then as a Jew. Klaus Moser, Lord Moser's father, was a wealthy Berlin banker, as many of you will know. He fought in World War I. And he and his wife, like so many others in their position, considered themselves proud and patriotic Germans. And it was a memory shared by many, many others. Milan Kosman, whom I mentioned, still with us but not here tonight. Hans Keller's widow, a wonderful artist. Milan quoted her dad saying around the table, "This terrible thing cannot last." This was about 1934-35. This silly little Austrian with a funny moustache. Germany is a civilized nation, my dear. These barbarians will soon be out. Just, keep your head down. Fred Ullmann, you might know his semi-autobiographical novel, novella really, reunion about a young Jewish boy brought up in the 1930s. And the father there says, "I know my Germany. This is a temporary illness, something like measles, which will pass as soon as the economic situation improves." How often have we heard that? Do you really believe, my dear, that the compatriots of Goethe and Schiller and Kant and Beethoven will fall for this rubbish? These cultural references are very significant. Again and again, it's music, art, literature, culture that refugees from Nazism mentioned when reflecting on what had made them and their families so proudly German. Klaus Moser told me in a sentiment shared by countless others, he said, in Britain, culture was the icing on the cake, whereas we were raised to think that it was the cake. I don't want to give the impression that Austro-German Jewry en bloc was oblivious to its Jewish legacy. Of course not. There was a thriving religious life throughout the German-speaking world. You only have to remember the number of synagogues destroyed on Kristallnacht. Something I was born that very week, and I often think what it must have been like for my mum and dad to have born this little baby boy and then reading what's going on in Kristallnacht that very week. And of course there were synagogues, rabbis all over the German-speaking world. Think of the huge contribution later made to Anglo-Jewish life by people like Emanuel Jacobowitz, chief rabbi during the Thatcher years, or in the reform and liberal communities, Leo Beck, Maybaum, Hugo Gryn, I showed you a picture of him before, John Rayner, and so on. And of course, many of the Central European Jews, like Weidenfeld, became ardent Zionists, for example. The interesting question from our point of view is not why rabbis like Jacobowitz or Gryn. Is there a chair somewhere? Must be a seat. Yeah, there's one right here. Come right and join me. And is there another somewhere? I hate them, but oh look, they're lots. They're lots. The question I think that's interesting to me is not why people like Jacobowitz or Hugo Gryn retained their Jewish faith, but why so many Jews from Central Europe, although virtually oblivious to their Jewishness, seemed to excel in particular in the intellectual and cultural worlds. Was there anything specifically Jewish about their achievements? I've thought a lot about this. I think there are both positive and negative elements to the answer. The positive thing is this: I mean, throughout Jewish history, from biblical times really, great emphasis has been placed on learning. You know, from the biblical Moses to Moses Maimonides to Moses Mendelssohn. It's the prophets, the philosophers, the scribes, and the scholars who are the role models. In the old shtetl, the rabbi was not so much a preacher or a prayer leader as a teacher, a scholar, the person responsible for the education of the next generation, the only figure in town capable of solving difficult questions of Jewish law. Even Jews who were not particularly conscious of their Jewish ancestry or believed they had transcended it or disavowed it, you know, Marx, Heine, Mahler, and so on, Freud, tended to gravitate towards achievement in the intellectual and cultural worlds. So devotion to learning is a constant theme throughout much of Jewish history. In fin de siècle Vienna, Jews made up about, I don't know, 10% of the population, but something like 30% or more of the pupils enrolled in those elite grammar schools, the gymnasium, something that Tony Grenville has been writing about very interestingly in AJR Journal, which you should look at. But there was a negative side as well, of course. If you were a young Jew in early 20th century Vienna or Berlin or wherever, you would have been unlikely to aspire towards a career in the army, diplomacy, politics, the church, obviously. These professions tend to lend themselves to the sons of the social elite, and a young Jew, however gifted and ambitious, would have been courting rejection if he had set serious sights on them. It was partly a question of anti-Semitism. You only have to read the prose works of Wagner or the political speeches of the mayor of Vienna at the turn of the century, Karl Lueger, or recall the fate of Alfred Dreyfus to know that anti-Semitism was not invented by Hitler. Far better to gravitate towards those fields in which Jews, you know, with all that gymnasium education behind them, tended to be more widely accepted. Medicine, the law, the sciences, economics, philosophy, music, and so on. So there were both push and pull reasons, I think, why Jews tended to go into these kinds of professions. Culture was very often a gateway to social mobility. Which raises the question, was it all social pressure? Was there nothing particularly Jewish about the achievements of the Hitler emigres who were Jewish? Ernst Gombrich, the art historian, said to the end of his long life, he said that Jewishness had nothing to do with his art history. Who cares, he would ask, whether this or that historian or philosopher or art historian was Jewish? And he would add, he was quite outspoken, many of you will have known him, he would add pointedly that such questions were more the domain of the Gestapo. And I understood what he meant. From the opposite corner, I remember Lord Jacobowitz telling me with equal vehemence that he could see nothing in the ideas of Marx or Freud or Mahler or Trotsky or Einstein for that matter that arose in any way from their Jewish backgrounds. As an Orthodox rabbi, Jacobowitz regarded the historical importance of such people as lying outside Jewish history and therefore neither influenced by it nor contributing to it. I wonder about this. I've spent my life wondering about it. Mention of Trotsky brings to mind another writer who tried to grasp this thorny issue. Isaac Deutscher, his biographer, of course. Deutscher wrote an essay which many of you will know called The Non-Jewish Jew. And he considered what he called the great Jewish heretics, the people I was just talking about. He added Spinoza, Heine, and so on to Marx and Freud and the rest of them. And he wondered what, if anything, they had in common. And to Deutscher, it wasn't a question of race or ethnicity or religion or religiosity. He argued that these people, and others like him, probably himself included, gained their special strength from the fact that they dwelt on the borders of various civilizations, borders of various religions, national cultures, even brought up on the border lines of historical epochs. And I quote, "Their mind matured where the most diverse cultural influences crossed and fertilized each other." And he goes on, "They lived on the margins or the nooks, or in the nooks and crannies of their respective nations. Each of them was in society and yet not of it." Stephen Bellows, writing, many of you will know, writing about the Jews of Vienna, shows how they inhabited, quote, "the center of culture, but the edge of society." In other words, the very fact that Marx and Mahler and so on transcended their Jewishness and reached out to cross boundaries of mind, place, even time, arose paradoxically from deep within Jewish history, according to the Deutscher theory. Jewish achievements, therefore, at least in part, that of a people on the move, a scattered diaspora, a cosmopolitan people linked by the shared legacy of settlement, upheaval, flight, and temporary resettlement somewhere else. The idea that provides the key is that of living on the frontier, in a phrase of Sander Gilman. It's a view of Jewish history that puts a modern, rather positive gloss on the old image of the wandering Jew. In Judith Kerr's lovely semi-autobiographical, you know the little book When Hitler Stole the Pink Rabbit, and the little girl is asking her father, they're on their way to exile in Britain, and the little girl asks her father, "Do you think we'll ever really belong anywhere?" And the father replies very gently, "I suppose not. But we'll belong a little in lots of different places, and I think that may be just as good." In my own research, I've come across this sense of homelessness as being regarded almost as a virtue, just again and again. The bags are always packed, at least intellectually. And indeed, many of the Hitler emigres gravitated towards international, multicultural, cross-disciplinary areas of interest. I think of journalists, people like Hella Pick, for example, who gave British readers a broad international perspective on the stories of the day. Publishers like Weidenfeld or Deutsch, who tried consciously to act as a bridge between languages and cultures. Many historians, Hobsbawm, classic example, who helped us study historical processes across national and cultural boundaries. Gombrich brought to art history insights from psychology and anthropology. The musical compositions of Joseph Horowitz, some of whose family are here, whose father, incidentally, of course, founded the Phaidon Press, which published Gombrich. Joe Horowitz showed again and again how traditional stylistic boundaries in music could be creatively crossed. The excellent biography of Koestler by David Cesarani is entitled, revealingly, The Homeless Mind. And I suspect Deutscher was therefore not alone in believing that this very process of travel, or travail, across boundaries, is one of the things that, in part at least, has defined Jews and Jewish achievement over time. Let me get on to my third topic, which is that, of course, travelling over boundaries is what also defines the emigre, the exile, the refugee, the asylum seeker. The total number of migrants from Nazi Central Europe who came to Britain those who settled here, some went on to America or Australia and elsewhere, but those who settled here was in the broad region of 50,000. Many were, in effect, asylum seekers. Think of the 10,000 youngsters who came over with the Kindertransport in the last year or so before the war. Now beautifully memorialised at Liverpool Street Station, by the way. Do stop and look at that little sculpture when you're there. The Kindertransport that brought people like Zygmunt Nissel and Peter Schidloff, later of the Amadeus Quartet, people like the filmmaker Carol Rice. Could Britain have been more generous? Should it have been? Complex issue that I don't want to go into now. Before we rush to judgment, which is too easy to do, remember that Britain, like America at the time, was going through severe economic recession in the 30s. And I don't think anybody in 1936, 37, 38 could quite envisage the mass murder factories that we set up just a very few years later. So, big topic to talk about maybe later on when we chat informally. Come back to our own times then, the perspective from now. In our own times, refugees have of course again been knocking at the door asking for asylum in Britain. The largest number from countries such as Iran, Libya, now Syria, not so long ago from former Yugoslavia. All over the world, indeed, people are trying to migrate in ever greater numbers from the poorer or more unstable regions of the world to the wealthier, while governments such as our own struggle to find policies they think will be wise and just, and at the same time politically acceptable. Difficult juggling act, not helped by a popular press happy to fuel rampant xenophobia. Immigrants everywhere have always been thought by some to be something of a threat. They are by definition other. They're alien, straniero, foreign, dangerous. Might be anarchists, terrorists, foreign spies. You know, immigrant groups have traditionally contained these too, sometimes really and sometimes in the imagination. Churchill government in summer 1940, fearful lest there might be some among the refugees from Central Europe, infamously, of course, collared the lot, and in turn artists and architects, musicians and the rest on the Isle of Man and elsewhere. In Britain, ambivalence towards the outsider, the other, has always run deep. Particularly, I suspect, ambivalence towards continental Europe. You know, right now, you read opinion polls that show comfortable majorities in favour of Britain leaving the EU, for reasons that lie deep in insular national culture and psychology. But when it comes to culture, in the old-fashioned sense of the arts, well, the Brits have tended to regard the Europeans as rather good at this. You know, think of the continental scholars at the court of Henry VII, or the Italian musicians, or Holbein at the court of his son Henry VIII. Think of Rubens or Van Dyck or Handel or Sir Charles Halley. In the 18th century, no gentleman was considered properly educated unless he spoke French and had undertaken the Grand Tour. In the 19th and into the 20th century, any British musician worth his salt had to go and study in somewhere like Leipzig, while any decent artist had to be exposed to Paris. So the story of the Hitler emigres, as I look back now, with current waves of migration and the debate that's going on at the moment, is, I suppose, just one chapter in that long story of British ambivalence towards the continent. Similar in a way to the story of the Huguenots, who fled Louis XIV and came to Britain in the late 17th century. In both cases, some in Britain were very hostile, questioning the whole wisdom of letting them in. There were anti-Huguenot riots, there was anti-Germanness. Max Perutz talked about the fact that although he was a refugee, as it were, from Nazism, people heard his accent and said, "Oh, I didn't know there were so many Jews among the Nazis." And that kind of idiot, you know? In retrospect, of course, looking back, most consider the new arrivals to have added greatly to the rich cultural mix of their new homeland. Oh, the Huguenots, they brought silk and weaving and silverwork. Wasn't it wonderful? Could we equally summarise the impact of the Hitler emigres? Looking back from now, I think I can say that by mixing their labours with what they found when they got here, one of the things they tended to do was to help to professionalise aspects of British culture. Think of the transformation of art history, which 70, 80 years ago was basically a kind of Sunday afternoon pursuit, preoccupied with delicate questions of aesthetics and connoisseurship. And it's now become a highly professionalized academic subject as pioneered by Gombrich and his colleagues at the Warburg Institute round the corner. Or the somewhat amateurish atmosphere at Covent Garden that upset George Schulte, Georg Schulte, when he came as music director, and he said he was determined to professionalize it and turn it in his unique way. I sang under him many times. He was scary and wonderful. And he was determined to turn Covent Garden into the finest opera house in the world. You know? And I think by the time he left, he probably had done so. He'd certainly professionalized the place. I've mentioned how cross-disciplinary, cross-cultural is the work of many of the Hitler emigres. And I think their presence also helped to cosmopolitanize Britain's still somewhat insular thinking. Nikolaus Pevsner introduced the ideas of Gropius and the Bauhaus to a generation raised on Tudor-Beathen revival and Garden City. Martin Esslin, who was head of drama when I was at the BBC, wonderful man, he introduced the work of Central European playwrights to British audiences. At the same time, like many previous groups, most of the Hitler emigres wanted to do whatever they could for their country of adoption, their new Heimat. And there are countless touching stories of refugees having found a new home in Britain. They made every effort to read the Times and roll their umbrella and wear bowler hats. I remember Martin Estlin saying, I learned that I had to pretend I liked having milk in my tea and eating what's it called, kippers. You must know the wonderful story of the man who, desperate to get British naturalisation, finally gets his papers. He's summoned to the office in 1948 or 49. Long after, you know, Home Office had other things to think about in the previous few years. And he goes along there with his friend Helmut, and he's given British naturalisation. And he's so thrilled to bits, and he bursts into tears. And Helmut says to him, why now are you crying? Now you are made English, you are crying. What's the matter with you? You should be happy. He says, I am happy. Well, I don't understand why we had to lose India. and you know, you don't get more English than that. I thought of all those funny pictures of David Cameron in the newspaper. Today, of course, things are different. Things have moved on. We now live in a very different world. Today, earnest expressions of national pride and Englishness or Britishness are a little suspect. People have come to emphasize more and more not what unites them, but what differentiates them. People are more likely to identify themselves as black or Asian, or Welsh, or Scottish, or straight or gay, or lesbian, or senior citizens, or unemployed 30-somethings, or whatever it might be. Those who've come to this country from elsewhere, I live right near the Edgware Road, completely Arabic nowadays. People who've come to this country relatively recently tend to identify more closely with the culture they've come from than the culture they've come to. They are members of the Somali or Pakistani community, or Muslims. I think of the Tebet test. I mean, they're more likely to go to Lord's and perhaps cheer Pakistan or the West Indies than the English team, but that's kind of all right. That's the world we are living now. It would be unfair to blame them. It's no longer the fashion in our modern world to identify yourself too closely as a nation, which is why we're obsessed with trying to define what is meant now by Britishness. But I have to say again, looking back, that if the Hitler emigres made a major contribution, which they did, to the life and culture of their new homeland here, it was partly eased by the fact that they tried to identify as best they could. They didn't forget Beethoven and Kant and all that, and Goethe, but they tried also to learn the English language, to work in it, to identify with British values, to subscribe to its civic structures and traditions, in a way that later migrant groups have done much less. It's time for us to tighten our seatbelts for gradual descent. But before we land, a few final thoughts, a few words of caution. I think we must be careful not to exaggerate the long-term impact of the Hitler emigres. My children, who are now in their mid-30s, they're not particularly interested in the legacy of expressionist film, or modernist architecture, or modernist music of Schoenberg and his pupils, or of Kokoschka, or Koestler, or Pevsner, or Popper, or Max Perutz. My kids, they live in a world, a 21st century world of Brit art and postmodernism and computer graphics and the internet and Afro-Caribbean influences and world music and so on. Things have moved on. And I should also say that the impact, the contribution of the Hitler emigres, great as it was, and it's hugely enriched my life, was not the be-all and the end-all and the main and only thing in British cultural history of the last 50, 60 years. I was brought up in the world of Laurence Olivier and Peter Brook and Peter Hall and Tippett and Britten and Fontaine and Nureyev and Francis Bacon and Bridget Riley and Henry Moore and so on. John Brain, John Wayne, Amis Senior, Kingsley Amis. A very, very rich cultural world, and I haven't mentioned any of the Hitler emigres who were, they helped irrigate this rich world, but it was not a world without culture, had they not come. So let us not overstate their presence. However, their impact was important, and in the way it intermixed with what was already here, and that, I think in a way, 2 and 2 made 5. They added an important ingredient, one that, as I've said several times, has immensely enriched my own intellectual and cultural life. And I'm glad we caught it when we did. I don't know if it's just that I'm getting older, but every morning now the first thing I turn to in the newspaper is the obits. And we lose friends. I couldn't have written the book about the Hitler emigres 30, 40 years ago. They were in mid-career. Most of the people I interviewed and wrote about, they wouldn't have wanted to talk about their early days. They had a back-to-watch, a career. They were on the move. 40 years from now, of course, the whole story will have gone. It'll be like Napoleon or Julius Caesar or the Franco-Prussian War, simply a subject of study. It will have gone from living memory. As we speak, I find it very moving to feel that this whole subject is moving from memory and becoming history, and that gives it a different perspective. So, let me sum up. There's 3 topics that I emphasized. The war and the Holocaust, Jews and Jewishness, immigration. These 3 topics have all risen once again to the very top of the agenda for different reasons. In the aftermath of the attacks of 9/11 and on the tube system in London and on other Western targets, Madrid and elsewhere, we've once again had to recognize that there are forces in the world apparently as destructive in their intent as Nazism once was. Secondly, the very nature of Jewishness and Jewish identity is once more being urgently questioned, re-examined, redefined, both in Israel and in the diaspora. And the whole question of immigration. Migrants are seeking a home in Britain and elsewhere, many of them fleeing from oppressive regimes and anxious about the kind of reception they'll receive from ambivalent governments and frequently an antipathetic press and public. As we gradually adjust to the hatreds, the fears, the anxieties, and the opportunities of our still young 21st century, we might do well to ponder once again the startling silver linings that can encircle even the darkest historical clouds. And in particular, the cultural enrichment from which Britain has always benefited, thanks to people coming here from elsewhere. Whether from ancient Rome, remember they were here for 400 years, medieval Angles, Saxons, the Normans, the Huguenots, the Hitler emigres, and doubtless people who are coming here now. Final thought, I've been talking about this country, but of course the whole story of the cultural impact of the refugees from Nazism was global, not just British. I've travelled a great deal for this. I've lectured in Australia, New Zealand, and the States and Canada, and all over the place. Everywhere I go, someone comes up to me after the lecture. I remember in rural Queensland somewhere, "Oh, Mr. Snowman, most interesting lecture. When I was a kid, my piano teacher was a Mr. Bernstein. I now realise he was one of the people you've been talking about in your lecture." All over the world, huge, huge impact. So I want to end with a quote, and this thought. It's one of the great ironies of history that Hitler, who tried to stamp out a culture that he abhorred, ultimately, after a stupendous amount of death and destruction, succeeded in the long run in bringing it to the entire wider world. I want to end with a quote, not from a Brit, but from an American. Just think of the impact of the Hitler emigres in the United States. It provided a home not only for such great luminaries as Einstein and Thomas Mann and Brecht and Schoenberg and so on. Countless migrants of all kinds always had, but particularly that generation, very, very important, the whole Hollywood film industry and so on. But also for a great many painters, Chagall, Max Ernst, George Gross and so on, art historians of the caliber of Panofsky, and the great figures from the Bauhaus, some of whom I've mentioned earlier on. The director of the Institute of Art in New York at the time was Walter Cook, and he had all these geniuses knocking on his front door from Europe, particularly in the late 30s. Of course, America's not in the war until December 41. And Walter Cook apparently, according to Panofsky at any rate, used to enjoy, enjoyed shocking people a little bit. So when Europe was at war but America wasn't, there'd be these cocktail parties around the Art Institute, and he'd go to people at an opening somewhere, and he'd say to them, you talking about Hitler? Don't malign him. He's my best friend. He shakes the tree, and we pick up all the apples.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure we'd like to thank Daniel Snowman for a very entertaining and very reflective and interesting and wide-ranging talk, and I would certainly like to do so on behalf of the Research Centre for German and Austrian Exile Studies, at whose invitation Daniel has come and spoken to us. I thought this was really on a par with the, in a way, with the talk that Professor Heinz Wolf gave for the first of these lectures 2 years ago, in the sense that it combined learning with entertainment. And I think I can say very fairly to Daniel Snowman that he wears his learning very, very lightly and conveys a serious message and a lot of information in a form that will have kept us all very interested and indeed amused and constantly thinking. I'm aware that we're under a little bit of time constraint as there's a reception with drinks afterwards, but I think we have time for some questions, so if anybody has questions to ask our speaker, Daniel Snowman, please do so, though I would ask you to keep them reasonably short, please, so that we have time for several. Please.
You mentioned that there were about 50,000 Hitler emigres, or taking Austria and Germany together. And of course you mentioned the famous ones. Do you have a more or less a breakdown of the occupation of the others? Well, surely they were not all intellectuals. There must have been the odd plumber.
The quick answer is that I don't, and my own particular work has been about the high culture, as you know. And there are others, some of them in this room, who work much more, in fact one of them is standing very near me, on the migration as a whole, much more broadly. And I wouldn't want to generalize about large numbers of people. What I would say, and I said towards the end of my formal talk, that we shouldn't exaggerate the cultural impact, because I suppose the majority of them were like all the rest of us, you know, hard-working people who tried to live a decent life as best they can and got on with whatever they were good at. There were some at the other end who were, you know, stupid and idiots and psychopaths and criminals and all the rest of it, like any other group of people. They were not quite like every migrant group because they tended to be, I'm grossly oversimplifying the whole, but I have to. They tended to be the more able, more resourceful members of that society who perhaps had some money, they could sneak away, or they had a relative in Oxford or Cambridge who'd look after them, or they had a skill that they thought the Brits might be interested in, or they had somebody they could go on to from America from Britain. And I suppose it's probably always true of migrant groups that the people who get up and go and manage to get out and have the energy to do it tend to be the more resourceful people. I can't give a breakdown overall, but I can think of some baddies, and I can think of large numbers of people who opened a business here, did a bit of translation there, opened a shop there, became a school teacher there. They all brought, as all migrations do, something of their culture in the broader sense. I often get asked at the end of a lecture on a subject like this, not to an audience of this kind, but a more general audience around the country, Mr. Snowman, very interesting, but do you think the present immigrants are going to contribute to British culture the way the Jews did? And of course there are about 8 things in that that make me squirm. But one of them is, you know, ask me back in 50 years' time and we'll be able to see. I'm sure that sartorially and gastronomically and linguistically and architecturally, in all sorts of ways, they probably won't play hide and string quartets, but they'll do other things that by then will become valued to the society of the future. In other words, the answer to your question, Donald, is no.
During your talk, you touched on the Jews in the early and mid-1930s who consider themselves good Germans. I think this won't make me squirm, but how many of those were practicing Jews? How many do you think were practicing Christians? And how many of them weren't anything, so to speak?
There's an awful lot of expertise in this room. It's simply something that I don't know. I do remember as a child, there was quite an antipathy between the existing Anglo-Jewish community. I was brought up, as I said, in a family of Ashkenazi Jews from the Pale, who went back, most of them, to the 19th century. And we were religious Jews, Orthodox Jews, and we slightly made fun of the refugees, the Yekkers, for being snobby and superior, and the fact that they had denied being Jews didn't help them, did it? We said in a rather silly way, you know, but that was the caricature at that time. I don't know the answer to your question, but I think it was quite widespread to, if I may split an infinitive, to not put the Jewishness at the top of the identity, but to put the Germanness higher up, until Hitler made them realise the importance of their Jewishness, which wasn't a major element in their self-identity until then, for many of them. Numbers I can't begin to tell you. Does anybody know? Monica, you must have thought about this.
I'm not.
Sure.
It's not statistically.
Charge you.
Well, I can go.
Yeah.
Daniel, for a start, the figure of German-speaking refugees in Britain on the outbreak of war is generally considered to be 80,000.
Oh,
I know some of those then went on to American
yeah. This is 50
and that is the figure that Louise London includes in her book.
Yeah.
I think that's probably the most, the best figure we have. Of those, it's generally reckoned that 10% were not Jewish.
Yeah.
So that means that 90% were. So, you know, it's possible to do the math.
Most were.
On that, yeah.
But how many of those would have been practicing and how many of them would not?
Oh, well, that I can't really question. I'll give that back to Tony, I think.
Yeah.
So on that point, I mean, we've often had an argument about this before, and I have to say it again, as I've said it many times before, that figure of 80,000 is vastly inflated because it includes all German nationals, including the Nazi Germans, of whom there was a substantial number, and German citizens, journalists, businessmen, etc., etc. There were about 20,000 of those already in Germany before 1933 and they stayed. So you cannot simply assume that every German national who's in Britain in 1939 is a Hitler emigrant. There were 20,000 people who were not.
Yeah.
But Rudolph, a lot of those went back on the outbreak of war. They were given the opportunity to do so.
Yeah.
Well, we can talk about that later.
Any more questions? Any more questions, please? I thought I saw a couple of hands. Gentleman at the back.
Raymond Coffer. Just interested in your quote from Bella as to being at the centre of culture and at the edge of society. I come across quite often, I'm a Jew, I'm a second generation immigrant, that I still live in an Anglo-Saxon Celtic tradition country. And do you think it's changed that much, or will change that much from what Bella said? Do we still live on the edge of society? Or are we part of a UK Anglo-Saxon society which seems to be promoted?
I can't answer as an academic or an intellectual. I just feel that I live in London. I live right near the Edgware Road. It's all Arabic, as I said. I travel quite a lot. I like to think, and I'm probably kidding myself, I like to think that I'm at home everywhere and I travel a great deal. And yet, at 3 o'clock in the morning when I'm awake and a little anxious about myself and life, I think, yes, I'm at home everywhere, the bags are always packed, I travel a great deal, I'm a homo universalis, but everywhere I go I tend to meet people who live rather like myself, whether I'm in Berlin or Vienna or Antarctica or Delhi or New York. I wouldn't want to answer for we. I do know that I get irritated when people say to me, Daniel, do you feel English or do you feel British? I think it's a nonsensical question. The answer is I'm both, and I'm lots and lots of other things as well. I don't know that, but I mean, I resist the simple labelling one way or the other. But that's me, not the subject.
Please.
I mean, if an immigrant is going to settle down in this country or any other country for that matter, he's got to have some kind of means of earning his daily bread. And that may not apply to many of the others who haven't actually mentioned. And the scientists did reasonably well, because there were British scientists who found jobs. But the writers, I mean, you mentioned Alfred Stark, he didn't settle down at all.
Couldn't.
His children did. Or Max Hermann Einstein, I'm quoting from Richard Dodd's wonderful book.
Oh no, you're right.
You know,
yes.
And I mean, yet they didn't go back to Germany. Perhaps funding was a problem, or getting a job. The scientists didn't return to Germany. There couldn't have been jobs in universities and things like that.
No, you mentioned a very important point. I was talking about the positive gloss
Yes.
of the high cultural impact of the emigres. What I didn't talk about was the fact that, I mean, in my book I hardly talk much about painting, for example, or literature or drama. The people I mentioned, like Koestler, or Judith Kerr, who wrote very successfully, that's one thing. But you're quite right, particularly older, when I talked about the generational thing, for some of them it was very, very hard. Some of them were destroyed by the experience of coming here. Klaus Moser's father, a very rich banker in Berlin, he would have 12 important people for dinner, you know, every other evening, and finally lived in, you know, I think a semi-detached in Putney, and was very depressed in his last years, of course. Many of them had skills that were not easily applicable. Some of the scientists were lucky because during the war, the youngsters from the university departments went off and fought in the war, so many of the young scientists who were working in a field that is international, physics wasn't very different from one country to another, found they could get a job at a good university. If you had a skill that was, if you could play a violin, you might get a job. If your skill was dependent upon super fluent English, like being a theatre critic, you might very well find there was no job for you, and particularly among the older ones. And there were stories of great unhappiness. If you were a woman, I mean, it's a very sexist lecture I gave, but for good historical reasons. if you're a woman who was used to having a husband bring home a dozen people for a big, important dinner party, and you were the head of the family and head of the household, and you had all your servants, you managed to get out, and you come to this country with your big brother, or maybe your dad and your mum, and what do? You're working in service somewhere, just, you know, cleaning the house for a pittance for some other British family, and it's very demoralising. Happened to many of them, particularly to the women. No, I mean, there is a downside to all this again, and you're quite right to raise it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think because time presses, I ought to call the discussion to an end, and thank our speaker once again, and also take the opportunity of thanking Daniel Miller for his generosity that enabled these series of lectures to be held in the first place. And thank you all very much for coming, and I hope you'll join us
Come have a
for
drink
a drink afterwards. Thank you.